the first image I have is of what we call the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, a fantastic area that starts from Myanmar, right? Myanmar has 6,000 meter peaks, stretches the Himalayan arc clear to the Karakoram region in Pakistan and Hindu Kush in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And then we have the Tibetan Plateau behind. A fantastic region. Lawrence often talks about Padmasambhava, and somehow he made his way almost over the entire region, which is quite remarkable as well. I like that image too, for a reason that it gives us a physical image without political boundaries, and allows us just to think back and say, what could we do in this region without borders that divide us? And I believe the Himalayas are a region that can actually connect people together. And I believe that's also what this conference is about, is connection. And the mountains can do that. It's a region that is shared, and we do have to get back to the political reality, but it's shared by 8 different countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. About 240 million people live in that mountain areas. One of the remarkable features are the 10 major river basins that come from mountain areas. We have Yellow, Yangtze, Yarlang, Tsangpo, Brahmaputra, Ganga, and Indus Basin, and a few more. And if we add that up, about 1.9 billion people, 1/4 of humanity, rely somehow on the Hindu Kush Himalayan, at least for water resources. If we think about energy and food, probably much more than that in the region. It's also a biodiversity hotspot, and we heard about ecological civilization, and I absolutely very impressed by that thinking about how to move forward, how to protect that important ecology and environment in the region. And in fact, the problem is we're losing habitat quite rapidly in the mountains for this hotspot. It's remarkable too that even today we're discovering new species. And I love this one, the leaf deer in the area. It's about that big, about the size of your hand, discovered in northern Myanmar. Also the snub-nosed monkey, right, a primate discovered just less than 10 years ago. I think that reflects something, that there's a lot to be discovered in the region, but it also reflects that we just know in our modern scientific knowledge not enough about the Himalayas, and we have not tapped into the traditional knowledge to find out more as much as we could. So it's a big role to really develop that knowledge, share that knowledge, and put it into use. So my argument is what happens in the mountains matters for 1/4 of the world, yes, but it matters for the whole world. And what's happening in the mountains is a lot. Change. It's incredible rate of change with globalization, with outmigration, with connectivity, changing expectation of young people in the mountain areas. So it's the context is very much about a rapidly changing mountain world. So one way to deal with it, and this is really the reason to discuss this, is one way to tackle it is, can we get together, collate our knowledge, and bring that into the policy and political discussions? So there's a program called Himalayan Monitoring Assessment Program, and the idea is to get the best state-of-the-art knowledge together about the mountains, and then somehow have that influence policy and political discussion. About 350 people have been involved in this. It's a growing number, it's a process. And what I wanted to do today was to invite more people, and especially people, business leaders, to get involved as advisors to this assessment. Because where we're at is we have developed a lot of the science, but what we need to do is turn that into policy recommendations, right, that countries can take forward. Also policy recommendations that will support sustainable businesses in the region. That's why I feel it's so important at the meeting today to have the business leaders involved in this kind of discussion. when we look at another map, the red dots are population density. So we have these red dots outlining the mountains and hills of the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. And we see the great population density in the Yellow and Yangtze River basins, but also the Indo-Gangetic plains. But one thing we also recognize is decisions about mountains are often not made in mountains. They're made in Delhi, they're made in Islamabad, they're made in Beijing. So one thing we have to do is bring that understanding of mountains to the capitals. And as we'll find with climate change, we have to bring that understanding to the rest of the world. People in Himalaya. One fantastic thing is the diversity in culture. We've measured about 1,000 different living languages in the hills and mountains of the Himalaya region. And it's that diversity that will help carry us forward through challenging times. But just to focus a little bit more on people, it's the Hindu Kush Himalayan region poverty rates are quite high in the region. We just had International Women's Day, and we recognize that there is a gender gap in terms of women's leadership, education, all kinds of areas as well. So we do have many issues regarding poverty alleviation in the region as well. But on the other hand, we see this as a source of traditional knowledge, the people as a source of inspiration, and a source of ideas. And one big idea that came out of Bhutan was happiness, right? We have the GNP, why not gross national happiness, right? That's what counts. And so it's remarkable that Bhutan was able to spread this idea and kind of get it accepted through the world. This is a mountain idea, right? And so we might see poor people, but somehow what counts is happiness. It's interesting what they count. What they say is culture is important, natural resources are important, governance is important. So even if we're getting wealthier, but we're losing our cultural roots, if we're losing our natural resources, that happiness may be lost as well. So it's very important to pay attention to culture as well. On the other hand, still we have out-migration where those cultural roots are being challenged. We have globalization where those cultural roots are being challenged. So really our challenge is to have that development, yet keep the Himalaya, keep the culture of the Himalaya and the ecosystems intact as well. Climate change. So we have all kinds of changes, and then we have climate change on top of that. One remarkable part is that what we recognize looking in the past is that at higher elevations, temperature is rising faster. It gets hotter faster at higher elevations. Then if we look forward with some modeling, what happens with climate change? And we agreed in Paris that the global average should be about 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But what happens in mountains at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 feet, what that means is 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees. And if we don't meet that, it's going to mean 3 or 4 degrees in mountain areas. So what we have is it's already too hot for mountains. As a consequence, when we look to our glaciers, and David Brashears did this wonderful photography, 1921, when George Mallory went up to the top of Everest, they had this marvelous pictures of the glaciers. And many years later, we can see the shrinkage of the glacier. I'll do that again because it's kind of interesting. You keep your eye on that place and watch what happens, if it will happen. Yes, and we can see that shrinkage, both the horizontal shrinkage and the vertical shrinkage of the glaciers, leaving behind these glacial lakes, which presents new hazards even as we're looking forward. So a big question is then, with climate change, what happens to that water resources in the future? By the way, that glacier melt is prevalent right across the whole Hindu Kush Himalayan region, except in the Karakoram region. And if you ever hear the term Karakoram anomaly, some of the glaciers there are advancing. Science does not quite know why that's happening. But if we look at and this is a result coming from HIMAP, is what's happening to the water resources. If you're up close to the glaciers, you have problems. There'll be we're losing a lot of storage in the form of ice, snow, and permafrost. We also see that in the future there'll be more rainfall So maybe we won't lose that much water, but that's not necessarily a good thing because we'll have more intense rainfall events, more floods, more droughts in the future, and higher uncertainty when we manage water. So we really do have a water challenge brought about by climate change. Moreover, with climate change, we'll have changing agriculture systems, changing ecologies in the region. This is a village in Ladakh, Ladakh, and you can see, I got to go back, sorry. Those are the glaciers, these postage stamp-sized glaciers, feeding this wonderful agricultural land. They just have a few years left, that's all, right? What to do? And people have actually been inventing, I mean, we're testing, say, solar pumps to bring water up. People have been developing artificial glaciers in this area as well. But how to adapt is a really huge question moving forward. That's a rather depressing image of Kathmandu. And Arniko Pandey, Arniko's here, he's our air pollution expert, did this from Hatiban. A few things from this. This air pollution, yes, bad for health, but it also impacts agriculture yield. It also raises temperatures and causes the glaciers to melt faster. It's also something we should be able to do something about it rather quickly. And I like that, Elizabeth. The political commitment has to be there to make it happen. I do want to say that if we look at, again, that Indo-Gangetic plain, what we see is that haze over the plain. It's what we're breathing today is not just Kathmandu, but it's coming up from the plains, from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and beyond. So it is a very much regional issue. Probably today it's forest fires, it's agricultural burning in the region as well. So we have to work together as a region to solve this air pollution problem. So getting back to the water, yes, glaciers, that's a bad thing. What I'm most concerned about is the hazard of floods increasing in the region. And floods become a disaster, it's depending on how we manage it. But what we do see is this hazard of floods and the urgent need to develop early warning systems and work with communities to deal with that in the future. So I've talked a lot about change, and usually it's on the negative side. But what we have to do is turn that equation around and recognize that change does bring opportunity when we're moving in the future. We see a lot of opportunity in mountains, in high-valued mountain products, and sustainable energy, tourism, for example. But what I don't see, and I would like to challenge this for our business community, I think there has to be more business involvement in the mountain areas, done in a good and sustainable way. And I'm hoping that we can get together and discuss that more as we're moving ahead. As the last part of my talk, what I wanted to do, I've given some findings and from this Himalayan monitoring and assessment program, but I wanted to just give a few more findings of that with this. I'll just leave the one, this is my last photo in the background. This is Mount Kailash, Khang Rinpoche. And if you go around the mountain, you can enter a new life. That's a wonderful thing about Kailash, but it's a holy place for many religions. But I just use that to reflect a little bit. What was this monitoring and assessment program telling us? Number one, we have to do something globally about climate. Climate action is so important for the mountains. Number two is, it's not the mountain people causing climate change. Mountain people have to adapt. We have to invest a lot more in adaptation, helping mountain communities in a wise way. And we also expect that the business community is also investing heavily in mountains on adaptation. So we're hoping that the private sector plays a role. The second result is that we have to really pay, in that development effort, in the investment, we have to pay extra effort on socio-cultural issues and ecology. And that's why that ecological civilization is so important, right? We have to bend over backwards and see how to sustain the important ecology and socio-cultural system in the region and take that into consideration in development efforts. Third is that mountains are unique, mountains are different. And in policies and programs, mountain perspectives have to get embedded in mountain policies, in the political discussion. We need more mountain leaders in the political debates in our countries as well, more mountain women coming forward and expressing their concerns in mountains. Fifth, a lot of these issues are regional. If we work together, we can have far better, more optimal use of resources for energy, to deal with floods, for example, to deal with pollution. So that regional cooperation is important. I'll come back to that. Now, what the authors did in the assessment is they said, what could the world look like in 2050 or 2080? What would we like to see? So there's a prosperous path, maybe something like that happiness in Bhutan, where there is prosperity, there's happiness, there's great ecosystems, right? But there's other pathways. We can think of a business as usual pathway. We can think of a downhill type pathway that we want to avoid. The worst case, the downhill, we don't take climate action. We let environmental degradation increase, and we're likely to see more conflict. And at all costs, we have to avoid conflict in the region. That's the downhill scenario. So we have to do everything to avoid that. Another scenario, business as usual, is kind of muddling along. We take some actions, kind of prevented or kind of on the spot ad hoc actions. We'll probably still see pollution. Somehow we'll find our way through, but it's not at all going to be optimal. We'll see suboptimal uses of resources. But the most interesting one is the pathway toward a prosperous future. Now, there's typically a debate, right, between people who say, okay, let's work with communities, let's empower village people, empower women, work with ecosystem services, organic agriculture. And that's one approach. The second approach is let's have hydropower, let's have roads, let's have connectivities. The disadvantage of that is it might undermine local ecosystems, local cultures. The disadvantage of the first approach is you might not get that economic growth. What the authors were telling us is that those two, that bottoms-up approach and that infrastructure plus regional cooperation, have to go together to receive that prosperous future. So we need that on-the-ground vision, right, of communities, culture, ecosystem, and then we need this good investment in connectivity, roads, infrastructure, going together. So we have to spend extra time to do that as well. The final thing I wanted to say is thinking about the importance of regional collaboration. We take inspiration from the Arctic region, where there's an Arctic Council. We take inspiration from the Alps, where we have an alpine country, where countries, governments actually get together and have discussion around environmental health issues, around science as well. What we're missing in this region is something like that, say a Himalayan Council. And I believe that if governments could get together and really form some kind of body where governments are talking to each other and developing joint solutions for these problems, it will move a long way forward. So we'd like to do at ICIMOD what we'd like to join hands with others, Himalayan consensus, to see if we can see if there's a way to have something like a Himalayan Council. It'll take its own form as we're moving forward. But I leave you with that thought, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.